Louis, thank you so much for coming and joining our Translators series interviews. Can you please start by telling us about yourself? How did you come to translation and what attracted you in this field?
Yeah, sure. As you just told me, my name is Louis Labrec. I'm a French translator. Actually, when I was a kid, I was dreaming of becoming a scientist, a biologist. I did botany, I did ornithology, but I was interested in language too. I read a bit about Finnish and Turkish. I found it fascinating. Anyway, but I never really thought of translation. I was kind of naive. I thought that books translated by themselves. If I ever read an Agatha Christie novel, I thought it was written in French, but at some point you figure out it doesn't work that way. Anyway, so I started university in physics, and I realized it was really not my cup of tea after a couple of years. So I switched to translation because I wanted to do something a bit more practical than what I had in mind, which was historical and comparative linguistics.
Did you complete a translator training program then?
Yes, I did my bachelor's degree at Université Laval, then I did a master's at Université Montréal. Actually, I translated poetry. I took a course on American literature, so I translated poems by Sylvia Plath.
Wow. So how long have you been in the field?
Not good at that, 30 years maybe.
Wow. So, and you mentioned that you're a French translator, but what is your combination? Is it French into English or English into French?
English into French, because usually translated to your native tongue, at least the language you master the most. That's easiest and most idiomatic for you. Anyway, I was raised in French only. That's the only language I could speak as a child. So.
Okay. So, what are your fields of specialization in translation, and what do you enjoy most?
Don't really have fields of specialization. Certainly not legal and financial, because I have some trouble understanding those texts. I was really good at fragrances and beauty products, even if I don't use any, because it's so sensuous and so lyrical. And I love music and use a lot of musical terms such as chords, harmony, melodies. And I did children's books, which was a lot of fun. So I would say I'm specialized.
But I could see that you're into creative kind of
Oh yes,
work.
definitely.
So what do you enjoy most about that?
Finding a way to say in French what's been said well in English, or if you can say it even better, is great. Sometimes you have what they call, you have to compensate, because they say, oh, that's a bit flat in French. It's flatter than English, but a bit later you find something that's a bit less flat than English. So it's creative in English, it's creative in French, but not necessarily in the same places.
I see. So for that, I think it's really important to keep up to date all the topics, new topics, tools, everything that can help you sharpen your skills in both languages. So how do you keep up to date?
Well, I read a lot in both French and English. To be honest, I always buy the same magazines. So Gramophone, which is a British magazine for music in English, and when I go to Quebec, I buy a Diapason, which is the same in France. In French and in France, because it's magazine from France. And also by Le Monde Diplomatique to keep abreast of international politics. And National Geographic in English, and of course novels in both languages. In Toronto, it's not hard to, to hear English and to read English. French is more of a challenge, but even then you can find French books and French magazines.
How about translation tools and technology? Do you use any?
Of course, we have translation memories, like we have XTM here that we getting introduced to. Uh, let's say it's a learning curve, so some people have more trouble than others, and there's a few bugs to fix. And I've just been installed Antidote, which offers, for example, a list of synonyms and antonyms, grammar rules. So it's useful when you're in Word and you translate. And it's new for me. It was installed today, so I have to learn how to use it. But I was told it was not difficult.
Okay, that's great. So in your opinion, what is the most important skill a modern translator should have?
A translation has to be idiomatic. For me, it's really important. That's why you translate into, at least most of the time, your mother tongue. Because it has to flow. It doesn't, in French we have a saying, it doesn't have to look like a translation. There's a nice thing about, say, Mozart, that the art hides the art. It's so skillful that you don't see the skill. So ideally, a good translation should be seamless. I mean, you wouldn't guess it's been translated.
Okay.
But ideally, of course.
How do you approach the translation? What's your first step?
Well, sometimes we don't have enough instructions from the client. Sometimes you have to push a bit. Is it meant, for example, for young children? And in French, we have like two pronouns for you, which one is polite, which is vous, and one is familiar that we seldom use in translation is tu. But if we talk to really young children, sometimes, should I really use vous? That's one of many examples. You have to know the level of language you're going to use. If it's an email, and sometimes something as simple, what is to be translated? Are these instructions or part of the text to translate? Sometimes it's not obvious.
So what do you usually start with? Do you like jump into translation immediately, or do you do the scanning of the text?
I'm old school, so I always print it. So I have a look when I print it, and I say, okay, and I talk to my project manager, and who's the client. Actually, it's in the system, so I know who the client is. And we have lexicons and glossaries, so I need to open them to know right away who the client is. And what type of text, and what time I have to do it.
Okay, can you tell us how you usually deal with difficult terminology and culture-specific elements that you cannot find equivalents in glossaries?
Well, culture is something, as I told you previously, I'm from Quebec, so to adjust a few things when I arrived here, and some things in the culture were not familiar to me. For example, that's nothing to do with translation, but it explained a bit how different it is. I was invited to picnic, Martha Stewart picnic. I had no idea who Martha Stewart was. And sometimes some references that now I've been living in Ontario for over 30 years, so I'm a bit more, actually I get a bit disconnected from Quebec culture sometimes when I go back to my family. What are you talking about? Who's that person? But to go back to translation, for example, I can give you the example of in the ballpark. The first time I read that expression, I had no idea what it meant. I think it has to do with baseball, but usually they use it as a metaphor, meaning approximately. So now every time I see it now, it's a reflex. I know it's approximate. But the first time I said, and for me it was brand new. And I remember I did a test when I was much younger, and there was like every cloud has a silver lining, and I translated it literally. I didn't know the expression. So you get used to the culture, just living in it, it really helps.
Yeah, so you, how about metaphors?
Oh, sorry, I have another one. When I was living in Windsor, that's decades ago, and somebody told me, Louis, you're not in Kansas anymore. I didn't get the image at all.
So
But,
can you explain to us what it
but
is?
it comes from the Wizard of Oz. It means you're not at home anymore. You're not a little kid anymore.
Yeah.
But for me, I remember I answered, I know we're in Michigan, but that was not the point.
Oh, I see. So I know that you also mentioned before about the metaphors, that most of the culture-specific elements come from three fields.
Oh yes, sports, which is not my forte. The armed forces, anything military, and Star Trek, which I'm better at. And sometimes I say, okay, like in the ballpark was an example, and that comes from baseball, I think, I'm not sure. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
So do you, like, when you cannot find the explanation on the web, like, what is your strategy of dealing with them? Will you ask someone?
I can ask my coworkers. Actually, my sister was a great source for anything like pop culture, pop music, or friends. Sometimes I disturb my friend. I have a friend who's a psychologist, so I had a question about tests in psychology, but she took me 3 months to answer, but it's still nice. But the client didn't wait that long.
Yeah, exactly. But then at least you would know at the end
Yes.
for the future.
Yes.
What do you do when you don't understand the source text or a certain part of it?
Well, I try to read it as linguist. That's very useful, but you have to be careful. There's some anglicisms, and sometimes the French is not that correct, but it helps you. And worst case scenario, you just ask the client, please, I don't understand the second paragraph or the third sentence in the second paragraph. And so they rephrase it. Sometimes the rephrasing is worse, but anyway, you try your best. And I used to work for let's name it, the federal government, and the meeting minutes are just awful. They use a lot of acronyms, often the wrong acronyms, which doesn't help, and the syntax is just faulty. So you try not to do any guest translation or guesslation, but it's really not obvious. But you try to communicate with the client.
Okay. But sometimes we receive a badly written source texts from the
yes.
client. So what is your strategy of dealing with them, with such texts?
Once again, it's a bit the same. You do your best and you try to, sometimes the syntax is just horrible. It depends. I think it's worse at the government. I used to work for a museum, it was well written. In here too, usually the texts are readable. And you can ask your Anglophone friends. Actually, I used to work when I was in the federal government next to an Anglophone who was doing the opposite, French English, and we help each other. So we tried to, because she showed me some really bad French. I couldn't help her. It was illegible.
So as you mentioned, you normally translate into your first language, which is French. Do you still accept assignments from French into English?
Rarely, seldom, because sometimes they cannot find Anglophone translators, so it's a rush, so I do my best to help them. The problem, obviously, with English translation, as you can hear it, it's not my mother tongue, so I'm not as comfortable as I am in French, so for me it's a bit harder to see if it's idiomatic or not. And I always ask for a good English, a good Anglophone reviser when I translate into English.
So does it usually also depend on the field or type of documents? Like, do you think, okay, this type of documents I can handle into English?
Yeah, if it's legal and into English, on top of being legal, it's, maybe you should find somebody else.
Okay. So maybe something like official documents, like birth certificates, something that is standardized.
Yes,
That's fine, right?
anybody can translate the weather report. Probably I couldn't even translate it into Russian, it would be that bad.
Wow. Okay, Louis, thank you so much for your time and for your wonderful examples and insightful comments.
You're welcome.